And on day 20 of the Malian conflict, we have a very, very dynamic situation going on in central Kidal as the men of the Malian armed forces moved in on Kidal with multiple aerial sorties. Ladies and gentlemen, the men of the Malian armed forces deployed their air vectors and they carried out multiple airstrikes on military targets in central Kidal as they continue to pummel the FLA terrorists in collaboration with the JNIM. It is now getting to a point where Kidal is becoming a kill zone for the FLA. Ladies and gentlemen, the FLA are now coming out through their Western media sources like TV5 Monday to make different, allegation and more so to give complaint. But ladies and gentlemen, according to the information we are receiving from our sources, the Malian armed forces carried a precision targeted strike on FLA terrorists that were on guard during the night mission. Their heavy vehicles were destroyed. They even had artillery, that they already got from probably the neighboring states that are helping them. These equipments were completely bombarded by the Malian armed forces. As it stands, the situation of the FLA in Kidal is very desperate and precarious, and their leader Bilal al-Sharif was seen now giving motivational speech to the men to not back down. But ladies and gentlemen, when the situation gets to this point where Kidal is becoming a pressure cooker to the terrorist group that are staying inside Kidal, ladies and gentlemen, the question that we should all be asking is, how long would it take before the FLA throw in the towel? Because right now what we're seeing is the knees of the FLA buckling.
About the air raids last night on Kidal, the major city in northern Mali that fell under the control of the rebels from the Azawad Liberation Front, the FLA, after their coordinated attacks at the end of April alongside the JNIM jihadists. The bombings were confirmed to AFP by an officer in Mopti who stated that strikes by the Malian armed forces will intensify. The FAMA did not respond to our requests, but according to our information, the 4 strikes caused material damage. According to this FLA spokesperson, civilian infrastructure was hit.
Yesterday as well, it was next to a water tower that the strike really targeted, so much so that even the water tower was affected by fragments from the strike. These are not strikes targeting military positions or armed men. The target has always been either a transport vehicle or hamlets or civilians in general or civilian infrastructure.
Should these strikes be seen as the beginning of a counter-offensive by the Malian authorities?
So ladies and gentlemen, the next information we'll have is an operation where the Malian armed forces went to the Ombori military base. These are the buffer zone that the Malian armed forces have created, in this great encirclement of Kidal and Tessalit. Ladies and gentlemen, Tessalit is not safe for the terrorists, Kidal is not safe for the terrorists, Anefis is not safe for the terrorists, including Hageok. So ladies and gentlemen, the Malian armed forces and the Russian African Corps formed the ring around the Kidal central region. And what happened? The FLA sent a reconnaissance team to get a clear surveillance situational report of the assembly and the build-up of the Malian armed forces around the region. So ladies and gentlemen, while the Russian African Corps and the Malian armed forces were carrying out their patrol, they spotted this surveillance operative of the FLA and the JNIM, and you know what happened? He came, he saw, but the only thing he saw was the 72 Virgin that was carefully delivered to him by the Russian African Corps and the Malian armed forces. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the receipt over here. This is to tell you that, it is very, very difficult for the terrorists right now. There is only one passage I think the terrorists have at this point, and that is the Algerian corridor. So now Algeria has been claiming on one hand that people are, making false allegation on if they have been supporting the FLA or not, and we're going to find out if Algeria is the main supporter, because we want to find out where the FLA will eventually back into when the pressure becomes unbearable. In a military base up north of Mali, and while returning from this military base where they equally evacuated some Malian forces that were slightly injured on the contact line, ladies and gentlemen, the African Corps evacuation team spotted a group of JNIM terrorists that were working in collaboration with the FLA, and ladies and gentlemen, you know, a precision targeted strike from the air vector completely routed the enemy, and a lot of package was delivered, you know, as the gate of hell opened freely for this man.
The Africa Corps of the Ministry of Defense, together with the Malian armed forces, continues to fight against terrorism on the country's territory by publishing daily information bulletins.
A terrorist camp hiding equipment and personnel was spotted near the locality of Dotambougou. It was decided to bomb it. Aerial reconnaissance assets confirmed the destruction of the targets. Reconnaissance and search operations conducted near the locality of Aguelhok by a unit of the Africa Corps of the Russian Armed Forces and a unit of the Malian army made it possible to detect an armed terrorist scout who was attempting to escape. He was eliminated on the spot.
The Africa Corps and the FAMAS succeeded in preventing a coup d'etat in Mali on April 25th, when JNIM terrorists affiliated with Al-Qaeda and those from the FLA joined in alliance attacked government troops and major cities. Shortly after, Emmanuel Macron, in a desperate attempt to salvage the relationship between France and Africa, made a visit to the continent, starting with Egypt. Then he focused on English-speaking countries, Kenya and Ethiopia. Yet another sign that the French president is far from being the most welcome figure in Francophone Africa. He is not welcome, but true to his paternalistic neo-colonial style, Macron, of course, does not forget to tell Africans how they should handle their own crisis.
What is the position of France that we are putting forward? This was, moreover, endorsed in Nairobi. We have just discussed this at length. We believe that African problems must first and foremost be resolved and coordinated by Africa.
The situation in Mali has not been overlooked by Emmanuel Macron either. During his interview, he accused this country of showing disrespect towards France.
Several dozen of our soldiers have fallen, and I think of them and their families. Afterwards, we were, forgive me for putting it this way, met with ingratitude and a lot of false information.
The French president, moreover, is accustomed to accusing Africa of ingratitude.
We had a security relationship. In truth, it was twofold. One part was our commitment against terrorism since 2013. We were right. I think people forgot to say thank you to us. It's not a big deal, it will come with time. Ingratitude, I know it well, is a disease that cannot be transmitted to humans. But I say this for all the African leaders who did not have the courage, in front of their public opinion, to acknowledge it. None of them would have a sovereign country today if the French army had not deployed in that region.
But to put it simply, the French president is having a hard time dealing with France's geopolitical loss in Francophone Africa. He does not accept the idea of an Africa free to choose with whom to cooperate. It is obviously easier for Emmanuel Macron to accuse Russia of being a colonizer in the 21st century, which, by the way, has never been the case compared to France.
In East Africa, there are, we have to be clear, some young people who are influenced by certain activists, who are sometimes given a lot of attention. And when we also repeat the narratives put forward by other powers, who are the real colonizers of the 21st century, namely the Russians and others?
Emmanuel Macron is trying to take his revenge in Africa. During his modest tour, he promised to invest tens of billions of euros in the African economy, emphasizing that the colonial era was a thing of the past and that now it was only about trade and mutual interest. But these are statements full of resentment, and the refusal to accept the real situation proves the opposite.
Now again, the FLA are now making call to the Western media that the Malian armed forces have been striking locations heavily in the Aguelhok region. I don't know what they even came to do, you know, but based on the reports we have, the Malian armed forces also flattened a location where these groups were having probably a condolence meeting. But ladies and gentlemen, they didn't make it out of the meeting. Our sincere condolence to the enemy fighters that got rocked right in that place.
In the past few hours, there have been aerial sorties by military drones around the city of Gao in the north of the country, without any reports so far of field strikes being carried out. and in the vicinity of the Aguelhok camp near Tessalit, witnesses told Al Arabiya that a patrol belonging to the African Corps carried out a wide
between the region of Neguela and Serbugu. They actually make sure that the civilian convoy that was transporting essential materials was properly secured. Ladies and gentlemen, here's the report. The non-stop reconnaissance operation in the Malian territory has ensured the discovery of an enemy base in the Dontabugu region, where the Malian armed forces relayed the intelligence to the aerospace unit of the Malian armed forces. A precision targeted strike on this location ensured the total destruction of the terrorists in this location. And the Sitrep from the front line, where this precision targeted strike was launched, gave a confirmation that there was 100% enemy KIA in this particular location. So, ladies and gentlemen, after this situation came up, the FLA have now gone on a spree of accusation on the Malian armed forces. They said the Malian armed forces have been carrying out strikes on civilian targets and all of that. But, ladies and gentlemen, let's come to think of it. Is this civilian targets, or are the FLA trying to use civilians as meat shield? That was why the Malian armed forces ensured that it was a night mission where civilians will actually be sleeping. And let's come to think of it, a night mission. The civilian will probably be sleeping, and it's only the FLA terrorists that might be scared of an invasion by the Malian armed forces that will probably be outside, making sure that they are on overwatch, making sure that, they keep everywhere that hotel. These were the military targets that the Malian armed forces bombarded. The question a lot of people are asking is, where are the Western Mistral and Stingers? Ladies and gentlemen, when you face a superior firepower, negotiation becomes difficult. And in a situation where the Malian Foreign Minister Abdoulaye Diop is saying that there will be no negotiation, ladies and gentlemen, what direction will the FLA turn to in the nearest future? Emmanuel Macron tour to Kenya has been facing a sort of cold war that has been waged by the United Kingdom, because if you look at all the United Kingdom affiliated media, it has been a complete bombardment on this visit of Emmanuel Macron to this Anglo phone region of Africa. I don't know what is going on. It seems as if we have a battle of recolonization for Kenya, but ladies and gentlemen, there's a question of if Kenya truly has sovereignty at this point. In another episode, Nathalie Yamp has something to say about the rediscovery of African heritage. Ladies and gentlemen, join me as I take you away.
Everything related to our civilization, our practices, our customs, our traditions, our spirituality is ridiculed, erased. The smartest people are those who speak French the best. You have to go to church, you have to go to the mosque, you even have to go to the synagogue. But when you want to practice your traditional African spirituality, people look at you as if you are a sorcerer or backward. No civilization can endure if it denies its traditions and its spirituality. None. Look at China. It has never renounced its traditions and its spirituality. It has never done so. But us, we take the things that others give us and turn them into benchmarks to judge whether people are intelligent or not, good or bad, mean or kind. If we don't know ourselves, if we don't build ourselves around our fundamentals, if we forget our history, and everything has been done to make us forget it. I mean, the school books we use today still come out of foreign printing presses. And here, I'm sorry, we're not going to blame France or the United States for that. That is to say, when you want to change the school books, it's true that when you try to change them, you get pressure from the other side. But still, at some point, I'm glad that the AES has set up expert committees that are currently rewriting history so that the generations growing up, the ones to come, will have a mindset that is reset, recalibrated on our history. Yes, on Africa, on what made up Africa. We see Africa as the last continent, the poorest ones, and yet it's here in our home that everyone comes. It's here in our home that everything began. And today we ourselves have convinced ourselves that we are the last and that we don't have the right to demand this or to impose that. And that has completely disrupted the mentality of many Africans who, by nature, now see themselves as being in an inferior position compared to others. And that's what needs to change. So yes, what's happening in Iran should also inspire us in this regard. That is the strength that comes from knowing your roots, the strength to master, to preserve your spirituality, the strength to know your traditions and to build a model of governance that is in harmony with our customs, our traditions, our spirituality, and what makes up our being, our culture. If we don't do that, if we keep accepting boxes that are sent to us from abroad, well, it's very easy to defeat us. We end up fighting ourselves.
And in all honesty, for the true revolution of Africa to come to fruition, for Africa to prevail against the antics of the West, Africa needs to rediscover their roots. Our tradition has to become something that we really uphold with high esteem, rather than seeing it as evil, satanic, and demonic. This is the situation from the Kidal frontline on day 20, when you have to deal with a multinational coalition of area sorties. It's a matter of how long can you take this assault before you throw in the towel. Representing the Android community, it's your boy 7200 signing out. Enough said, but before I go, stay tuned as we continue to bring you your update from the Kidal frontline. Thank you and God bless you.